There was absolutely no doubt that they had executed the right man. Judas, a trusted friend, had identified Jesus for them. The Jewish leaders had questioned him. Roman rulers had interviewed him. Even his closest followers had mourned for him. They had the right guy. And there's no doubt that Jesus had died. I mean, on top of the physical abuse, the crucifixion, the excruciating pain, he was executed by professionals. They knew what they were doing. There was no question that he was dead. In fact, when Joseph of Arimathea asked for the body from Pilate, Pilate asked the centurion, "Are you sure?" The centurion said, "I'm sure." And so he was convinced. Pilate was convinced. The executioners were convinced. They were all convinced. In fact, they were surprised at how quickly that he had died. They were proficient at this kind of execution. In fact, they were so good at it that if they didn't accomplish their job, they would be crucified themselves. There's no doubt that he was dead. There's no doubt that Jesus' body had been buried. A guy named Joseph had asked for it, and he and a friend named Nicodemus had wrapped the body temporarily. They were rushed. It was close to Passover. They were planning to go back. But a stone was rolled in front of it, the entrance of the tomb. It was sealed because the Jewish leaders were afraid that the disciples might steal the body, might try to make a spectacle out of this whole scene. So they were careful. The body was in there. They were absolutely certain of that. And there's absolutely no doubt that when it came Sunday, that the tomb was empty. The body was missing. There was no question about that. In fact, the first witnesses to discover that we read about in Luke 24. It was on the first day of the week. Jesus had died on Friday afternoon. His body had been put in the tomb that evening. Now it's Sunday. It's early in the morning. The women took the spices that they had prepared. They didn't have time to fully get the body ready for burial. So now after Passover, now after the Sabbath, they're taking care of that. They went to the tomb. And they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. It's Sunday morning and it's early, and these women are the first to find out that the tomb is empty. They run back and tell Peter and John. Peter and John run full steam back to the tomb. They discover the same thing, that the tomb is empty. There's no question. There's no doubt. But what did it mean? In fact, the Roman guards who had been there guarding the tomb, they knew it. The Jewish leaders knew that. In fact, they had conspired. The Roman guards knew they were in trouble. They went to the Jewish authorities for help. They came up with a plan. In fact, the Jewish leaders had given them money to say, "We fell asleep, and while we were asleep, the disciples came and stole the body." So there's absolutely no doubt come Sunday that while the body had been there, the tomb was now empty. In fact, we don't know much about it. It's not there. We don't know why at this point in time, but speculation's beginning to rise. In fact, if we go back to the story about the women there at the tomb, they meet up with two angels. Jesus isn't there. The body's not there, but two angels are there, and they say, "He's not here. He is risen." And they say, "Remember how he told you? Remember while you were with him, the things that he said to you while he was still in Galilee? The Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners and be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." And then they remembered his words. Oh yeah, maybe this is a part of the plan. Maybe this is it. Even though Jesus had predicted it, the disciples, his closest followers, these women, they weren't prepared for it. They weren't sure about it. They weren't expecting it. And even some of his enemies, they heard it and they were not ready for it. And it wasn't until they found the empty tomb that things started to get a little clearer, a picture for them. In fact, consider all the different references that Jesus made. As I was kind of just taking a look through the Gospels, at least 4 times in the book of Matthew, Jesus predicted his death, burial, and resurrection. At least 3 times in the book of Mark. At least 3 times between Luke and John, Jesus says, "I'm going to be dead, and I am going to raise again on the third day." So his disciples had heard that. It just hadn't registered for them. In fact, it was such common knowledge that after Jesus had been buried, the following day, Jewish leaders go to Pilate and said, "Hey, we remember Jesus saying that he was going to raise from the dead, and so would you just make everything secure? Would you put a seal?" That's exactly why Pilate put a seal across that stone, a Roman seal, and he had extra security assigned to this tomb because they knew Jesus had said he was going to raise from the dead, and they were scared that the disciples would come and steal his body. But the body is missing Sunday morning. It is gone. There is no question. Except, is it possible? Is maybe Jesus, is he alive? Is that possible like he said? It was just speculation to this point. There had not been any witnesses. No one had seen Jesus. They just witnessed the empty tomb until Mary's left at the tomb by herself after everyone else has left, and the man that she thinks is the gardener comes up, and she says, if you've taken the body, let me know where it is. And as the man begins to talk, she realizes it's Jesus, and she calls him Rabbi, and then she runs back to tell the other disciples, I've seen the Lord. And their response? They didn't believe her. They didn't believe her when she said, I've seen the Lord. But Mary was the first one to see it. We know that Jesus appeared to Peter later that same day. It's Easter Sunday still. We know that Jesus appeared to two previous followers who were on the road to Emmaus. They had been in Jerusalem, and they were taking the trek to Emmaus, a 7-mile journey. It would have taken them 2.5, 3 hours to make that trip. And while they're walking along, a man comes along beside them. It's Jesus. They don't recognize him as Jesus, and they're walking along, and you can tell that their hopes are dashed. In fact, as Jesus begins to ask questions, they're thinking, where have you been that you don't know this? Are you a visitor to Jerusalem? The whole city's been talking about it. And as they walk along, Jesus begins to talk to them. It says that he pointed out from Moses and all the prophets the scriptures concerning Jesus. They finally get to Emmaus. They finally arrive there. They're in their home. They beg this man to stay with them. And it's not until Jesus begins to break bread with them that their eyes are opened and they realize that they're with Jesus. And just as soon as they recognize him, he disappears. The text tells us that they run all the way back to Jerusalem to report these things. They had just arrived from Jerusalem. They just made the 7-mile trip. Now they're going to run all the way back, and they are going to search out, and they are going to find the remaining 11 disciples. And sure enough, in an upper room, a locked upper room, they bang on the door. They get their attention, and they say, you're not going to believe this. All the disciples there, not Judas, not Thomas, evidently. All the disciples, some of the other followers are there. You're not going to believe it. What we've seen. And they're all saying, yeah, we're going to believe it. Because Mary has seen Jesus, and Peter has seen Jesus. And they're saying, we've seen him. We've seen Jesus. We were there in his midst. He walked with us. And they began to tell him the whole story. And the text tells us in Luke 24 that as they're talking, that Jesus suddenly appears and is with them and says, peace be with you. That might be a good thing for Jesus to say to them. Relax a little bit. Be peaceful. You're not expecting this. And so at least 10 of the disciples, along with these 2 followers and some other followers of Jesus, are gathered in this upper room, and Jesus appears to them, and he talks with them, and they eat with him. And then later in the week, we find out that he shows up with the rest of the disciples when Thomas is with them about a week later. At some point, he reveals himself to his brother James. At another point, there's a crowd of over 500 people that witness an appearance of Jesus. And what had been speculation, what had been doubt, what had been hopelessness is now turning out to reality and to faith and to a movement as they believe because they've seen Jesus. In fact, James, the brother of Jesus, who had been on the sideline, who really had not been a supporter, a follower of Jesus, suddenly becomes one after Jesus appears to him after his resurrection. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know what it would take for you to believe that your brother was the Messiah from God, but it would take something monumental. That's exactly what happened to James. He becomes a believer. He becomes the leader of the early church. In fact, Jesus' followers, these very people we've been talking about, become followers unto death. They follow Jesus. You don't do that for a lie. You don't do that for something that you construed and something you made up. But these people, they go to their deathbeds following Jesus and claiming that they'd seen him after the resurrection. Now, we cannot leave Easter Sunday without asking what that resurrection means for us. I mean, what does the empty tomb mean? What does the empty tomb mean? Jesus' resurrection confirms so many things about what he said and things that he mentioned while he was on earth. I want to talk about 4 of them before we finish today. Here's the first thing that the empty tomb means. It means that Jesus is who he says he is. All of the claims that Jesus makes, all the things about his identity, those are things that Jesus now can authenticate because of his resurrection. He claims that the claims that he makes about himself that we talked about in his story, his claims of being the Messiah, his claim of being one with God and the Son of God, all of those things authenticated by his resurrection. When Jesus said, I am the bread of life, and I will sustain your hunger for eternity. When he said, I am the light of the world, saying, I dispel darkness and I'll provide light for you. When he said, I am the good shepherd, they knew the shepherd. They knew they were the sheep of Israel. And Jesus announces himself as the good shepherd. They knew exactly that he was claiming to be God. When he said, I am the resurrection and the life, or when he made that exclusive claim, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. You don't have to believe those things unless someone can verify that they have the right to be able to say those kinds of things. And Jesus does that when he raises from the grave. No one else can make those kinds of claims, but if you come back from the grave, you can. You don't believe people who claim to be God unless they do something that shows they are worthy of the claim that they're making. And that's exactly what Jesus does. The empty tombs means that Jesus is who he said he is. The empty tomb also means that what Jesus taught is true. That the things while Jesus was in his ministry, while he walked this earth, the things that he taught, the things that he said, that those things are true. If he rose from the grave, then the things that he said are true. If he claimed he was going to be resurrected from the grave, and he was, then the other things that he said about life and about himself are true. It authenticates the things that Jesus taught. If he could predict that he would be arrested and tried and crucified and resurrected in 3 days, then you can count on everything that Jesus says to be true. You can believe what he says. And so when Jesus says it is better to give, it's more blessed to give than to receive. It sounds so counterintuitive. It seems so backwards to us. But if someone raises from the dead, you can believe it when they say things like that. When Jesus says, don't worry about your life, about what you'll eat and what you'll drink, seek first the kingdom of God, then as wrong as that sounds for us not to worry, we are so geared to worry, we can believe it when Jesus says, don't worry. Or when Jesus says, forgive people when they sin against you. It's so against our nature to do that, because when people sin against us, we've got this grudge, we've got this debt that is unpaid, and we want to settle the score. And Jesus says it's better for you to forgive them. It's better for you when you forgive that way. And when Jesus says love your enemies, we understand to love people that are nice to us, but Jesus says to do this unnatural thing about loving people that don't like us and that don't do good things to us. And when Jesus says, whoever wants to be the greatest among you must be the servant. It's just so foreign to us. It sounds so wrong and backwards to us, because we understand if you're going to be the greatest, you've got to power up and you've got to be influential over people. And Jesus says you do that instead by being a servant. When Jesus said, whoever wants to save their life must lose their life. In fact, if you try to save your life, you're going to lose it. But if you give it up, if you lose your life, you'll find it. And so it's different from what we understand. When Jesus said the first will be last and the last will be first, all of those things are challenges for us. But if Jesus rose from the grave, then all of those things that sound so wrong and sound so counterintuitive, then we can trust what Jesus says. We can trust those things to be true. And if it's true, then we ought to live our lives accordingly. So we can believe Jesus, that what he said is true. Well, the empty tomb also means that what Jesus promised is guaranteed. We can believe what he said about this life to be true, but we can also believe that what he says about future life, about eternal life, promises that he makes that seem so out there, because he rose from the grave, we can believe them to be true. It authenticates the promises that Jesus makes, the promises of eternal life. You know, it had just been the week before when Jesus' friend Lazarus had died in Bethany. And his sisters, Mary and Martha, get on to Jesus. Jesus, if you would have just been here, if you would have just been here, Lord. You remember Jesus' response in John 11? He said to him, I'm the resurrection and the life. And then he makes this outrageous claim, the one who believes in me will live even though they die. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. You cannot make claims like that unless you do something that backs it up. It doesn't mean anything unless you, like Jesus, are resurrected. And Jesus then would say, if you believe in me, then you're going to live forever. It's Rick Atchley that says Easter doesn't just announce that Jesus came back. It assures us that Jesus is coming back. It's because Jesus rose from the grave that we can believe that Jesus is going to provide an ultimate resurrection for all of those that believe in him. The empty tomb reminds us of that. And the empty tomb means that what Jesus offers really is good news. That what Jesus offers really is good news, that it is hopeful, that it's not just news, it's not just any news, but this is indeed good news. In fact, as you read through the story, it seemed that every time somebody learned that it seems like every time that somebody learned that the tomb was empty, they ran to go tell someone else. As soon as they discovered that the tomb was empty, they ran to tell someone else. The women ran back to tell the apostles. Peter and John ran back and told the other disciples. The two guys who were on their way to Emmaus, they run back and they share it with the other followers that are in the upper room. In fact, I want to go back to that story in Luke 24. I find it significant because as they're talking to Jesus, they're saying, we had hoped he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. At this point in time, Jesus is dead. Jesus had been put in a grave. They knew there was some talk about the tomb being empty, and they were discouraged and they were confused by it all. But maybe what sums it up most is them saying, we had hoped that he was the one. And now, dejected and confused and disappointed and maybe disillusioned, they're going back to Emmaus not knowing what to expect. And Jesus walks with them. Jesus breaks bread with them, and they suddenly have their eyes opened, and they recognized him. And he disappeared from their sight, and they asked each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road? They began to go back and remember the conversation, remember the trip, and while he talked with us and opened the scriptures up to us. Then they got up and returned at once to Jerusalem, and there they found the 11 and those with them assembled together. They made the 7-mile track that they had just come from. They returned on it again. And as soon as they talked with Jesus, they ran back to tell other people. In fact, it's not long after this that the apostles began to share it with everyone. They began to preach this very thing, that Jesus who died rose again. And they began to preach it in Jerusalem, and then the Bible tells us they preached it in Judea and Jerusalem and Samaria to the ends of the world. That's what they talked about. That the tomb was empty and they had seen Jesus. See, it wasn't his teaching that sent his followers to the streets. It wasn't the great miracles that Jesus did. It wasn't the moral life that he lived. It was the simple fact that he raised from the grave. It was his resurrection. You see, to some, this was just another hopeful group of people. It was just another religious sect that included a charismatic leader and a bunch of desperate followers. And in all these other movements, what would happen is when the leader died or when the leader was executed or assassinated, the disciples would disband and it would be another hopeless situation. But this time was something different. This time, Jesus' followers claim he rose from the dead and that they had seen him and that they had touched him and that they had eaten with him. And then it grew from just dozens of people to hundreds of people. Then it went to thousands of people. Then persecution comes from Jewish and Roman authorities, and his followers scatter, and they begin to share and insist with everyone that something profound had happened to them, that in their lifetime that God had raised Jesus up from the dead, and soon it became the primary belief system within the entire Roman Empire. The very same Roman government that had crucified Jesus suddenly becomes an empire that is infiltrated with Christians everywhere. Our world needs to hear good news. I don't have to tell you that because you hear it the same as I do every day. Our world is hopeless. Our world is hurting. It's filled with pain. It's filled with fear. Every day we hear in the news about something else, an airplane that crashes, a child that inflicts harm upon other children, people that murder, people that rape, people. And we just hear this constant barrage. Our world needs help, and it needs hope. It needs good news. And there's some of you today that are feeling that hope and that hopelessness and that hurt and that pain. You're feeling it. In fact, you're just like those two disciples. You had such high hopes. You'd hoped that things were going to be different. You'd hoped that things were going to be better. You had hopes in what your family was going to look like. You had hopes in what the new job or the business or the move. You had great hopes at things. And then you just got disappointed. You just got disillusioned with life. And what the empty tomb reminds us is that no matter what we're dealing with is that Jesus is alive and He overcomes death and He overcomes problems and He overcomes and brings hope. What does the empty tomb mean? It means that the Jesus who made claims that He truly is who He said He is. And it means that the things that He says and the way that He offers for us to live and says it's better, it truly is better, and we ought to live that way. When Jesus says He offers us something for the future, He offers us eternal life, the empty tomb means that we can be certain of that promise. And when Jesus says, I have good news to offer you, it truly is good news. And when you grab hold of that, you share it with as many people as you can. The question that we haven't talked about this morning, the question that really is the important one, the one that becomes more personal, is simply this. What does the empty tomb mean for you? What does it mean for you? Or is it just another story, another Jesus story, another Bible story that you're not sure about the validity of, and you're not sure if you really buy it all or not? Or is it something that you've allowed to shape your life? Has it become good news for you? Has it changed you? If you've never answered that question, then maybe today's the day that you go and you reconcile what the empty tomb has to say to you personally. If you've never done that, the question for you is simply this: what does the empty tomb mean for me?